Follow me down this deep, dark hole.
Welcome to New Horror Express, your monthly podcast giving you a look at the latest in horror as well as chatting to the best breaking talent the genre has to offer. I'm your host, Scott Murphy. In our debut episode, we're going to look back on the best horror of 2017 with my personal top 5 horror movies of the year. As well as that, I have a very interesting chat with young, upcoming Canadian filmmaker Torin Langen about his debut feature, 3 Dead Trick-or-Treaters, in which we discuss how the film came into being, his inspirations and influences, the world tour the movie did, and much more besides. But before all that, we're going to dive straight into my top 5 horror movies of 2017.
It was certainly difficult picking my top 5 horror movies, as 2017 was an excellent year for horror. Not to mention, a record-breaking year for horror as well, as the It remake became the highest-grossing horror movie of all time. And it must be said, as horror remakes go, and we all know that horror remakes can be pretty shit, this one was pretty decent. I wouldn't say it was top 5 material. I'd say it's maybe like a 7 out of 10 movie. There is many movies, though, that nearly crept into my top 5. Some of them include Yorgos Lanthimos' latest feature, The Killing of the Sacred Deer, which was a black comedy, psychological thriller, really interesting. Colin Farrell is excellent, so is Nicole Kidman, really great performances all round. Other features that I would say that I would definitely check out that just didn't make the top 5. 2 Australian features, Killing Ground and The Hounds of Love. Very dark, very gritty. Definitely worthwhile. There was a British black comedy. There was a directorial debut of Alice Lowe, who had previously co-written the black comedy horror Sightseers that was very good, called Prevenge. And as mentioned in the intro, Torin Langen's 3 Dead Trick-or-Treaters is definitely worth a watch if you can track it down. But none of them made the actual top 5. So now we roll on to number 5. My number 5 film of the year was The Void. The Void got mixed reviews because many reviewers felt that it was overly reverential. It was kind of paying homage too much to 80s films. But overall, I think the directors Stephen Kostansky and Jeremy Gillespie, whose names you may recognize from the Astron 6 group, who previously made genre pictures like Father's Day and Manborg, overall did a very good job and managed, while there is a lot of references, particular Carpenter references, there's at least 3 Carpenter movies it heavily relies on, those being The Thing, Assault on Precinct 13, and The Fog. And there's a bunch of other horror references that you can see in it. You can see a bit of Hellraiser, you can see a little bit of The Beyond. There is a whole shit ton of Lovecraftian stuff in there. So there's a lot of influences, and you can definitely feel them. But unlike their previous Astron 6 efforts, including the Father's Day previously mentioned, and also the shorts like Biocop, it's less parodic. There's less pastiche there. There's a more serious tone. There's a greater vision to it than I think some reviewers gave it credit for. And overall, while there's a bit of a lapse in the middle, and some of the acting performances are not the strongest, the creature effects are amazing. And that's not surprising given Kostansky and Gillespie's backgrounds in art department and makeup department for various big blockbusters, including Suicide Squad and Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak. You would guess that the effects were good, and they are. And they really cranked them up towards the end. And the finale is fucking bananas. And it's really great. It has great impact. When I saw it at Dead by Dawn, it was a real crowd pleaser. There was a lot of the crowd went out on a real high, and that's why it comes in at number 5. Number 4 was Mother. Again, another really weird, really bizarre movie. I've long been a big fan of the director Darren Aronofsky ever since I saw his debut feature, Pi, which is a crazy conspiracy thriller made on a very low budget, and it has a lot of twists and turns. It's very dense with ideas, and so is this movie. There is a lot of themes, a lot of ideas coming at you. While there was a lot of very strong reviews for it, some people were kind of down on it because some people decided it was pseudo-intellectual, but I don't think that was. You know, it kind of got slagged off a little bit for being arty and a bit wanky, but honestly, there's really strong stuff here. There's a lot of different themes that you can read into this movie, and there's many ways to read the movie. The way that the director Aronofsky and the lead star Jennifer Lawrence directed audiences to read it was in a biblical sense of her being Mother Nature, Javier Bardem being a God creator character, the house and the surroundings being a Garden of Eden, while the couple played by Michelle Pfeiffer and Ed Harris being an Adam and Eve type figures. And then obviously there's a Christ parable towards the end, not to give any spoilers because I know people on the internet are very excited about spoilers and I don't want to get into any trouble. But anyway, I don't think that spoils the movie. But that's not the only way to read the movie. There's many other readings. Another one actually suggested by the lead star was an environmental reading of this being a kind of pristine land at the start of the movie, but, you know, then crowds come and it's ruined and it's wrecked, and, you know, just like a parable for climate change and the way that we've ruined and wrecked the world we live in, not to get too heavy on this horror podcast. That's definitely one way to read it, but also there's male and female relationships and the way sometimes the women fall into a carer role, and there's stuff to do with the male ego. It's basically packed with metaphor. You can read a bunch of stuff into it. It's such an interesting movie. It's one that you come out and you want to talk about with people, and back and forth ideas of how you read it. And that's one of the interesting things about the movie, that when you listen to other people, lots of people come away with different messages from this movie. And it's a very intense movie, and one that you possibly have to maybe watch a couple of times, because there's certain parts of the movie that are almost too much. There's an intensity to it, particularly in the beginning, with so many close-ups to faces. And when you see it on the big screen, it's hard to take in, and there's a lot of quick edits and a lot of hard close-up shots, and it's a lot for your mind and eyes to take in. But if you go along for the ride, I think it's a very interesting film, and at times a deep film, and at times just a crazy, visceral film, and that's why it makes number 4 on my list. Number 3 on the list is Get Out, which is definitely one of the most topical movies of the year. It turns out that the racists in it are not necessarily the people you would expect. It comes from director Jordan Peele. This is his debut feature. He's not known for horror at all. He's known for a sketch comedy from his sketch comedy program, Key and Peele. The basic setup is much like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the old Sidney Poitier picture, where a white female, played by Alison Williams, who most of you will probably know, or maybe not, from the HBO program Girls, is taking her black boyfriend, played by Daniel Kaluuya, who's been in various British things, but is really just making a splash in America now, to her white liberal parents. They come from a well-to-do East Coast family. It's all very middle class. It all seems very nice. But then, just under the surface, you start to notice things. You start to notice that maybe these people aren't quite as progressive as they lead you to believe. They talk to Daniel Kaluuya's character a little bit differently to they interact with other white characters, and try and reassure him all the time how black friendly they are, and you know how they voted for Obama, and you're just like, they lay it on too thick, and then it becomes kind of creepy, and then you notice that the other black characters aren't quite reacting right. There's something Stepford wife-ish about them. You know, they seem kind of automated, slightly robotic, slightly distant. And then you start to think, what is wrong with this community? What is happening here? And what is happening here is weird. It's horrifying. It's got a lot to do with hypnotherapy. Alison Williams' mum's character, played by the great Catherine Keener, is a hypnotherapist who hypnotizes Chris, played by Daniel Kaluuya, and we start to realize what's really going on in this community. To talk too much more about this movie would really, really spoil it. There is so much that goes on. Really, I cannot talk beyond that basic setup. But what I can tell you is the horror in this movie is really good. It is not just good as a horror, it's really good as a satire. It really gets under your skin. This is definitely a movie that will test you, even if you think you're a white liberal progressive and you're woke and you're right on. This will definitely bring up some stuff and definitely make you think about things. And make you think more closely about things. And that is a great thing, that this delivers on the horror and it provokes thought. And there is a lot of very, very good laughs in it as well. And that's why it's number 3 on this list. Number 2 in the list is Raw, which is an art house French horror movie, which you may raise your eyebrow at. You may think, oh, art house, French, art, horror. That doesn't sound so good. You may think, oh, that sounds pretentious or wanky, but it's not. This is not your ordinary horror. There's not so much straight ahead horror in it, but when the horror happens, it's visceral, it's hardcore. The gore effects in this movie are excellent, and if any of you have seen, which I'm sure many of you have, seen any of the French new horror extreme movies, such as Martyr, Switchblade Romance, etc., you will know that whoever does the gore effects in France, they must have a lot of good gore effect artists, because this is gruesome. The basic setup is Justine, played by Garrison Marier, is a young veterinary student at a very scary, very hardcore vet academy who have some very nasty and interesting hazing rituals, one of which is they force students to eat a little bit of raw liver as part of the hazing ritual, which Justine's character very much does not like because she's a vegetarian. But as these things go, she sucks it up, to be part of the group and eats the bit of raw liver, which has interesting consequences. Basically, it gives her a taste for flesh. Human flesh. So yes, this is a cannibal horror, but not the kind of cannibal horrors you might be used to. Not one of those Italian cannibal horrors from the 80s where people go into the jungle and find cannibal tribes. And as you may remember from such films as Cannibal Holocaust and Cannibal Ferox and all those other Italian movies that have been banned over the years. Unlike those movies, though, this film cuts deeper than that. It's not just merely about cannibalism. There's a lot of different themes and things going on in the movie. One of those things is Justine's relationship with her sister and the bond she forms over these, what you would call, unusual desires. There's also an air of highly charged eroticism in the movie, as there's an intersection between Justine's rising cannibalistic desires with her rising sexual appetites. You see her at the start of the movie as a very meek, shy figure, and as the movie goes on, progresses, she becomes more sexually potent, more confident. It is certainly a very strong performance from Malia in the role as Justine, and shows this transformation very well. Other than these themes, the film is also very visually striking. It's a very good looking film. It's one that is always interesting to look at and is also very in your face. The film's got a very striking color palette. There's a lot of very deep blood reds running throughout the movie that definitely give it a unique look. And the film overall is a great calling card for the debut film director Julia Ducournau, who definitely looks like she will become one of the great female film directors of recent times. And there's been a lot of great female horror film directors that have come up in the last few years. Particularly last year, I saw The Invitation, directed by Karen Kusama. A couple years ago, it was A Girl Who Walks Home Alone at Night by Anna Lily Amapur, who most recently directed The Bad Batch, which you can see on Netflix. And before that, in 2014, there was Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, which neatly brings us along to my number one horror movie of 2017, Anna Biller's The Love Witch, which is a genuinely amazing creation. I'm cheating slightly because I actually first saw this last year, but I'm basing this list on UK general releases, so it came out in general release in 2017, where I rewatched the movie. I first saw the movie in the Edinburgh Film Festival in 2016, but I saw it again when it came out on general release, which is why I'm including it on my list. The other reason I'm including it on my list is because it's just a great movie. It has so many elements. The director has somewhat rejected the notion that it's based on a lot of horror movies. She doesn't seem to see the horror influences as much as viewers of horror movies and exploitation movies generally have seen, because it is an interesting mixture of stuff. You can see a lot of occult horror movie influences there. The influence of directors like Dario Argento, but also not just horror influences. You can also, and I'm sure she will reject this, you can also see the influences of directors like Russ Meyer, who directed sexploitation movies in the 70s. There's a definite sexploitation feel to some of the scenes, but apart from that, apart from the horror and the sexploitation, there's also, and the director has definitely confirmed this, a heavy influence of 1950s style Douglas Sirk melodramas. The story itself concerns the character of Elaine, played by Samantha Robinson, who is a character it seems on the run. There is a suggestion that she might have killed her husband, but you don't really know. And she comes to San Francisco to house sit for a friend. And her main mission there is to find love. There's a lot of interesting discussions about love in the movie, and discussions around feminism, around gender roles, around what people want from love, and how people will do sometimes anything to get it. And that's one of the strongest elements of the film. Also, another strong element is the fact that it discusses many of these heavy issues and discusses these philosophical questions and discusses things like some of it is pretty close to academic feminism, but it does it with the lightest of touches that keeps the viewer very interested, engaged throughout the movie. And at no point does it feel bogged down in any of these issues. And there's a lot of fun elements to the movie as well. There are many scenes that are genuinely quite funny, as well as, you know, scenes that lean more on the horror elements of the movie. And it has to be said, it's not a straight up horror. The horror is not particularly gruesome or grisly, but there is a definite horror feel to the movie. And some moments that feel like they're almost deliberately bad. Some of the acting is done in a kind of stilted, soap actory, melodramatic way. And sometimes you consider, is this bad acting? But actually, no, I don't think it is. I think that they're deliberately going for this style, this kind of heightened melodrama that it is that is entertaining throughout. It is kudos to Anna Biller on all her work in this production. I saw a Q&A with the director, and this film is all Anna Biller. She was the writer, the director, the producer, the set designer. She mentioned that the thing that took us longest to do in the film was there was a particularly intricate pagan-looking rug, which took her 6 months, which blew my mind. That is as a crazy fun fact for you all right there. But it is really a great achievement. It's only her second feature film. I really look forward to seeing whatever she produces next, whether it's horror or not horror. Definitely Anna Biller is a name to keep in your mind, whatever project she's working on now. And that's it. That's my top 5 horror movies of 2017. I hope you enjoyed it. You know, it's always fun to debate these things. If you want to comment below, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm right. I'm always happy to have a conversation. That's it from me. And now, on to my guest, Torin Langen. Hi, Torin. Welcome to the show. First off, I want to congratulate you on your film, 3 Dead Trick-or-Treaters, which I reviewed on another site and very much enjoyed. So first off, I wanted to know what attracted you to the anthology format? What was
well, let's see here. Well, first of all, thank you very much for reviewing the film for Slimehouse. Thanks for having me on your inaugural episode of your podcast. This is very exciting for me. In terms of what attracted me to the anthology format, I guess I have to back up a little bit of a ways. When I was in my teenage years, that was pretty much when I first started playing around with a camcorder. And I started shooting these little horror shorts with my friends, either as like high school projects or just, personal, goofy weekend endeavors. And it was, I always had ambitions to do a much larger project. But, when you're working with a bunch of friends and you have very little money at your disposal, you're kind of just out of necessity, you have to do projects that are a lot smaller in scale. So I kind of just grew up learning how to make films by working with either basically putting together stories that were based around only one or two actors. So when 3 Dead Trick-or-Treaters came around, I was sort of, I guess I should start by saying, you know, my age. Probably by the time that you listen to this, I'll be 24 by the time this episode comes out, and I started 3 Dead Trick-or-Treaters back when I was about 18. So it was a long time in the making for sure, but I was kind of at the tail end of that cycle. You know, I was just out of school at that point, and the first segment of the film, Fondue, was originally just going to be a standalone short film. But by that point, you know, I'd finally gotten the confidence together that no, I can, you know, I can put together a larger project like this that I've been wanting to do for years. And Fondue was sort of, again, it was meant as just a standalone short film, but after we finished it, I tonally and stylistically, it was what I wanted a larger project to be. So from there, I sort of went about writing the other segments for the film with a similar sort of style in mind. And the project just sort of ballooned from there. Every segment was kind of treated as its own individual film. I knew that I wanted to have that common thread of the style and the tone throughout all of the separate pieces, but I didn't have necessarily a grand plan of how all the pieces were going to fit together until pretty close to the end of the shooting. But yeah, it was I don't know, the anthology format attracted me because, at least for, you know, what I was working with, which wasn't a lot of money, it was out of, you know, my own pocket, I could kind of afford to shoot in small bursts with the money that I had and the volunteers that I had, and then, you know, get that segment through post-production and then start on the next one the following year. So it was a very practical format to move with. And also, I just like movies that feel like they cram in as much as possible into them. I like movies that feel like they have a whole bunch of different story threads and different visual textures and styles to them. And this being my inaugural feature, I kind of wanted to put showcase as much of what I was capable of in one project as I could. So that was kind of the impetus behind that. And also, I think too, a lot of, you know, with the advent of, you know, like home movie equipment getting more and more accessible, there's a lot of anthology projects that come out now that are kind of just, you know, a bunch of filmmakers get together and assemble their short films into a larger form project, but it often feels really disjointed and kind of not terribly cohesive. And so
that was an interesting thing watching it, having, you know, it's just you directing. I mean, like you say, obviously a lot of the more popular recent anthology movies, like the VHS trilogy and ABC's Death and all those sorts of things, like you say, are a bunch of very disparate directors all coming together, you know, who probably know each other and have very different tastes, and it's all very much crammed in together, and it doesn't always isn't always pulled off.
It's interesting listening to people talk about those films because they often don't seem like they're talking about the anthologies as a whole. They're kind of like breaking down what they liked about each individual piece, because it's not necessary. I guess that just sort of comes with the territory of having like a lot of little narratives. But at the same time, I think that's because there isn't necessarily the sort of an overall cohesive style that they're necessarily all working towards. So I guess that's why I like older anthology projects, like Creepshow is like an obvious one when it comes to that. But I also, one of my first introductions to the realm of experimental filmmaking was Czech surrealist Jan Svankmajer, and I would sort of devour these compilations of his short films. And the way that you watch those, you kind of, when you're watching a collection of short films by one filmmaker, it kind of is similar to watching an anthology feature in a way. And I would you know, watch his compilations of his shorts over and over again. And it's interesting because it's watching a series of works by one filmmaker definitely feels more like you're coming away with one singular experience than when you're watching an anthology project by a bunch of different directors. So not that I'm in any way comparing myself to Jan Svankmajer, because that would be blasphemy, but in terms of watching a whole bunch of works by one filmmaker, I think, I don't know, for me it's a lot less jarring, and those sorts of anthology projects are really more so what I was hoping to emulate with Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters, was the audience coming away being able to talk about the project as a whole and be able to identify with it as a whole, as opposed to sort of breaking it apart and analyzing a bunch of different filmmakers' visual storytelling and styles.
Yeah, and I think you pull that off. I think it is a cohesive set of shorts that have different stories that play on different themes, but have a similar atmosphere, and you can tell that it's the same mind behind it. The same.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. It was interesting too, because, like I said, both sort of all of the segments were. How do I describe this? So we didn't shoot out all of the individual stories all in one burst like you would with a traditional shooting schedule. They were, because I was working with mostly volunteers and, with whatever little money I could scrap up at a time. Each one of these segments was shot in the sort of September, October, November months over the course of about 4 years. So it was interesting, because I sort of went through post-production on these projects one at a time, and I didn't really know how the flow of the whole anthology was going to work pretty much right until the end, when I had all the finished segments and I sort of started sticking them together in my timeline. I had never done that until pretty much right at the end, and I was, it's a nerve-wracking experience at that point, because you're not entirely sure how everything is going to work together, because once you get into the flow of each individual piece that you're working on, there's the risk that you kind of will get too focused on that one piece and lose sight of the overall project. But the sense of tone that myself and the crew and the actors were all working with stayed totally consistent, I would say, over the course of the 4 years that we were working on it. And I found that everything, thankfully, all came together in the way that I had hoped. So it's
definitely
tough.
Has a through line in terms of atmosphere and feeling, which is impressive considering you did it over a 4-year period to keep that continuity.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was I don't know, I didn't really in hindsight, I guess I could see that as a challenge, but it wasn't really something that I thought about too much at the time. That was sort of it was an oversight, I guess, just because I had blind faith that it would work out. So I guess ignorance is bliss. It all panned out okay.
I guess it is sometimes. The other fascinating aspect of Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters is it's dialogue free.
Yes.
Was there any particular emphasis behind that?
To bring it back to Jan Svankmajer briefly one more time, him being such a huge influence just on, what I like in terms of filmmaking styles and textures. His films often were told without dialogue, often because they were meant as sort of a political allegory that he wasn't able to outwardly express with words. But just in terms of my own, I guess, filmmaking, self-made education, because I've never gone to film school. Like I said, I was often working with very small crews, and because of that, was often making films only really about one character, sort of thrown into a situation. And when you're making a film about pretty much one character, there's often no real excuse for dialogue. You're kind of just walking this character through a series of events that are happening to them, or that they're carrying out themselves. So those sorts of projects were what what I was working on prior to Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters. And then with
Mhm.
Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters, each segment is kind of about a ritual in a way that is being revealed to the audience as the characters in the film are executing the ritual or going through the motions. And because everyone in the film, for the most part, knows what they're getting into from the get-go, and they're just sort of, executing these traditions, there
Mhm.
isn't really a need for expository dialogue within the characters, because the story or what the film is about is being revealed to the audience as it goes along, and that's kind of where a lot of the suspense and twists come from. And I also, so that's just appealing to me. I think it's more engaging to look for visual cues, and it also forces you to pay closer attention because the film isn't being described to you. You're sort of just forced to sit there in the atmosphere of it. And I don't know, I felt that it made for a more chilling experience. And it also gave me an opportunity to work a lot more with the soundtrack of the film, which was, I had a fantastic team behind the soundtrack for this project. The
The
primary,
soundtrack is very good and definitely adds to the atmosphere of the movie.
it was interesting because it was a different approach to soundtrack than I had taken in the past on other projects, because the soundtrack in this film often has to speak on behalf of the characters, and credit has to be given to my primary composer on the project, Stephen Schooley. We met through the sort of Southern Ontario punk community, and he was
Right.
playing in a few different bands at the time, and he was going to school for composition. So getting him on board and the other people he brought on board, he was in school at the time and he had access to a lot more facilities, equipment, and musicians than projects of this budget level otherwise would.
Uh-huh.
So as a result, there's all sorts of live instruments on the soundtrack. There's some live woodwind, there's drums, there's lots of stringed instruments. We have live banjo, and none of I the atmosphere of a project like this is so important that if the soundtrack wasn't where it needed to be, the whole thing risks it risks the whole thing falling apart if the sound isn't up to snuff. So I remember had a hell of a lot of different sessions where he would bring me what he'd been working on, and I'd send him home with a series of notes, and just the amount of work that he put into all of that and put his people through working on that it was a tremendous effort. But what was interesting about that was the first segment that he worked on was Malleus Maleficarum, and then
Uh-huh.
he carried through to the very end of the project. The last thing that we shot was the wraparound, and by the time we got to scoring the very last piece of the film, which just so happened to be the very last scene of the movie, we were working on a really tight deadline because the film had been accepted to premiere at the Blood in the Snow Film Festival based on a rough cut, and we hadn't shot a couple of scenes that we needed before the film had been accepted. So in the last 2 weeks before the film was set to premiere, I had shot the last scene of the movie, got it posted, and then sent it off to him to score. And after working together for 3 years, he nailed it on the very first draft for that particular scene. So it took us 3 years, but we finally got each other's rhythm and
Yeah.
creative sensibilities worked out. So I thought that was pretty cool. So yes, thank you, Stephen Schooley, if you're listening to this, for putting in those hundreds of hours into this bizarre
That's
atmospheric
awesome.
horror
Well,
film.
hopefully he does when we go out. It was also interesting to see that you toured with the movie, and as well as America and Canada. You went to different parts of Asia as well, Singapore, Malaysia, China.
Yeah, that was that was a whole other process. So once the movie was finished, we premiered it last November, actually almost a year ago to when we're recording this. And then after the premiere, I touched a few things up, and moving into 2017, I decided that I wanted to take an alternative. A few different alternative routes in actually getting the film to audiences, because
Yeah.
Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters is not a typical horror film. It's it's not necessarily a hard genre film. It's a lot of the violence is more implied than overtly shown on screen. And what I knew going into it, and what I, continued to learn through the festival submission process, was that festivals kind of have to cater to an audience that they've built up, and oftentimes this audience comes to these festivals expecting a certain type of experience. So that's why even on the independent level, you'll often still just see a bunch of slasher films or zombie films or horror archetypes being programmed at these festivals. So for stranger projects like this kind of, atmospheric, non-dialogue, sort of folk horror film, it kind of limited our options in terms of where we could screen the film in the horror community. So I decided that I
has that more slow 70s vibe,
right.
Not the kind of same pacing you would get with modern horror. It's definitely that more vintage horror pacing.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of grindhouse films. So I can see why that it would be difficult to place it in a certain program that's definitely focusing on hitting that target audience for the modern horror fan that just wants blood and gore immediately.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess it was, so one of the reasons that I wanted to take this alternative screening route was, one, to reach audiences on my own terms and without having to necessarily have the film sent to a board to decide whether or not this thing I worked on for 4 years was going to actually be seen by an audience. But I also wanted to, like I said, I met Stephen Schooley through the underground music community in my hometown. And it was really important to me that the film reach that demographic. I wanted to sort of participate in the underground arts community, and not necessarily just the film community, but bring the film to audiences that maybe were more familiar with underground music than they were with film, or more familiar with different types of installation art. Because the film, it's not a typical viewing experience, so I wanted to see how it would play to these different types of artistic communities. So initially, I'd been inspired by this Canadian filmmaker named Seth Smith. He did a movie called Low Life a few years ago, and through his connections, through playing in bands, he booked this cross-Canada tour of the film that took place over the course of a weekend, where it played, I think, every province and territory in Canada over these 3 days. So that kind of, lit the fire under my butt to be like, well, hell, if
ambitious.
Yeah, exactly. And I had no idea what I was getting into, because I'd never booked shows before. So it was pretty much just a matter of finding every lead that I possibly could, either in terms of art galleries or micro cinemas or film societies, or basically anywhere that had a history with film projection or live music. And I just accumulated this massive list, and for a number of months was really just sending out hundreds of emails trying to get these opportunities to happen for the project. Initially, I'd planned on maybe getting like 20 confirmations, and by the end of it, it was close to 40 different shows. And some of those did include festivals. It wasn't just these independent screenings. I think between 10 and 13 of those were formal festival screenings.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was important to me that the film play as many different places as possible. And also, because there's no dialogue in the movie, that opened up the possibilities to where in the world the film could play. So yeah, the film played in Malaysia. Once was at this sort of arts oriented cafe called Narrow Marrow. The other one was at this punk venue called The Wall. There was this underground art society in, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the city right now, but it was in China, and they did a screening at their art school there. There was there was the one in Singapore. It played on a bill with a bunch of sort of more, I'd say death metal or grindcore bands. So it was.
That must have been an interesting.
That's the thing too. It was interesting to see what these venues would pair the film with. And it was cool, because I felt like, even if I wasn't able to attend all of these different events in person, that the film was kind of participating in the larger underground arts community. And, I've had ambitions for years to, pick up a guitar and start a band, but it's never really happened because I've been focused on film work. So this was sort of my opportunity as a non-musician to participate in the communities that inspired my work ethic sort of in the first place. So that was really interesting. And I'm hopefully going to be having another round of shows happening sometime in the spring. We're going to be playing a couple more, well, hopefully more than one European date this time. So there should be some more opportunities there.
I saw you came to Birmingham, but
yes. Yeah, we came to Birmingham. The film played Birmingham. We played Southampton at the Southampton International Film Festival, and I'm in the works now on getting something lined up for our London premiere. So, yeah, hopefully going to have another round of shows, probably smaller and more manageable on my end this time. But yeah, I've learned a few things from the last round of screenings, so hopefully things will be a little bit tighter this time around. But yeah, and hopefully some more festival screenings too. So we'll see what happens.
Well, that should be interesting.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. So now, obviously, Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters is out there and people are seeing it. What projects are you working on now?
I've
got
got a couple.
anything coming up, or any future projects you got lined up, or is it you just focusing on touring with Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters?
Yeah, I'm definitely at the point now where, coming right out of the film, I had sort of this burst of energy where it was like, oh yeah, this thing is done. I want to do a whole bunch more stuff now. And then, going into the winter, I was more like, okay, I'm happy to just take, take a few months off and just focus on getting the film screened. But now a year later, I'm sort of slowly getting up the steam to tackle another larger project. So I have some ideas on that front. I'm not going to really say anything about that because it's really just ambitions that I have for larger projects, and nothing's been lined up yet. But in the meantime, I do music video work as well, and all of those music videos kind of function similarly to the narratives in Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters. They're these sort of non-dialogue short films. There's no band footage in any of the music videos that I've done. And there's another one of those coming out soon for this band called Sinister Bodies of Water. I did a video for their song called When the Knife Calls, and that was comprised out of a larger project that I completed recently, which is this it's this triple screen installation horror projection called Offerings. So, and that's more of that was sort of my attempt to make a project that kind of looked like a living black metal album cover. There's a lot of ink texture in there, lots of sort of weird masks and costumes, lots of playing with layering different images that are being caught by harsh light in a particular way. So it's a lot of high contrast photography in that. And that's something that I'm looking to maybe expand into something narrative driven that's maybe half an hour long. But what's interesting and exciting to me about that particular project is that I kind of want to break it down into a series of different video pieces that can either function as short films or as installation videos or even as like background projections while bands are playing over top of them. So I'm kind of trying to, after getting the excitement out of Three Dead Trick-or-Treaters playing in these different venues and with these different sort of artists paired with the film, I'm kind of interested in participating in different types of visual film art, and just finding different avenues to get my work out there, because I think that filmmakers now are often too dead set on participating in maybe just the festival community or just relying on film festivals to get their work out there. They sort of put all this work into the project and then just start submitting to these festivals, and whether or not these strangers who they've never met like their film or not, that dictates whether or not, their years and years of work are actually going to be seen by an audience. And I prefer to take the hands-on approach and, make opportunities for the work I do happen, oftentimes on my own terms if I can get away with it. So I want to just try and find more ways that I can have my stuff seen by people, no matter where or how that might be. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I think you got to be a bit of a jack of all trades and a bit of a, I don't know. That was one of the things that I found exciting about underground film in the 70s, even in terms of, John Waters' early output, booking churches to screen his movies in, or
Yeah.
even going farther back than that, the old exploitation filmmakers who, kind of turned their films into road shows and booked out community halls and different non-theatrical venues to show their work. I think that we've kind of come full circle in a way now that it's so much more difficult to get your movies into theaters as an independent filmmaker. You kind of have to make it a spectacle yourself. You kind of have to adopt the DIY work ethic and find these alternative opportunities for yourself. So
I definitely think it's interesting to get back to that style of getting films out there. And I see what you mean about the festival circuit, and a lot of filmmakers do very much rely on that, and it possibly narrows them because they're just speaking to one particular audience.
Absolutely. It's something that's occurred to me too, where I've sort of been able to see every year it seems like there's another sort of mid-tier indie film that just gets a slot at it seems like it plays every genre festival. And you can kind of, I don't know. There's like maybe 3 or 4 of these films that are playing everywhere at any given time, and you can sort of see a lot of similar themes between these films, and it's almost like you can sort of develop a bit of a formula for what may or may not play well at festivals. But sometimes, it's a lot of it is just, it's a very political game as well. It's oftentimes who you know, but I don't know. It's definitely one of those things where
definitely one of those things where there's certain festivals that you can tell a film has come out a certain festival. You can, tell, oh, that's a Sundance type comedy, or you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
There's definitely a formula to these types of festivals.
Absolutely. And sometimes you can see when those are the types of movies that are gaining traction even on an indie level. I mean, that's what happened with Hobo with a Shotgun. Hobo with a Shotgun came out, and it was inspired a lot by, sort of the high contrast lighting of Suspiria or the Dario Argento stuff, and it kind of made it new again. And that was also what I think, in addition to, Planet Terror and Death Proof, kind of kickstarted the new age grindhouse style of filmmaking, which has just been done to death at this point. And that's kind of bled into, the pseudo, I guess like this new 80s sort of analog obsession. Everyone's trying to, stick their synth music in everything, whether or not it belongs in there or not, and it seems to me a lot of these projects kind of really miss the mark of what made those films fun in the first place. They think they can just, stick some colored gels on their lights, and they can put some, Casio on the soundtrack, and all of a sudden it's, an 80s throwback. And I find that a lot of times too, those genre tropes kind of work as a band-aid or an excuse for less than not necessarily great storytelling or not fantastic technical prowess. They can kind of just use this so bad it's good, or it's like a schlocky throwback as kind of this catch-all excuse for not putting the attention to detail into their films that they deserve. So
I think that's very true. I think there is a lot of this type of film that just throws a layer of irony on it and expects the viewer to watch it on an ironic level, which makes them not give it that attention to detail of what you were talking about earlier, of actually being properly attentive to the film.
It's I don't know. I mean, I guess that if you're marketing a film specifically to like the midnight festival crowd, I mean, those movies are often crowd pleasers because they're fun to watch with an audience, but I don't really know if those audiences really take those films like take memories of the films home so much as they do of the experience of just laughing with an audience, you know. And hey, if that's what people want to do, if people want to make movies that are specifically meant as, you know, sort of experiential crowd pleasers in that way, and then hey, that's fine. But I don't know, that's just not, that exclusively isn't what's exciting to me, you know. I don't just want to, you know, get a reaction out of people by grossing them out or sort of going for their horror pleasure points, I guess you could say. I'm more interested in movies that kind of build a sense of dread or a sense of atmosphere more slowly and methodically. So it's a lot. I mean, when I was younger, you know, I made, you know, goofy sort of splatter movies with my friends, and we had a couple screenings of those at like student film festivals, and that was fun, but it wasn't satisfying in the same way that, you know, I'm experiencing now by getting 3 Dead Trick-or-Treaters out there. So it's just important to me, like moving forward with my projects and with my career, that even if, you know, I'm hitting maybe a smaller audience than these festival favorites might be, that the people who see the film are really coming away with a strong sense of I don't know, just a satisfying horror experience that hit them in a way that other stuff that they've seen recently probably hasn't. So I just want to give people a unique experience, however I choose to do that.
And I think that would have more rewatch value than a lot of the films we've been talking about that are very good at what they do and fit very well at horror all-nighters, but don't fit so well probably just watching home alone, not getting that kind of satisfying horror experience. It's like you say, it's more about the experience, the communal experience of being with a crowd and laughing and cheering at the film, rather than actually something that properly chills you or gets into your marrow.
Absolutely. There was a film that I saw recently that, just on the topic of other movies that I think have done that well. I think it was an Irish film called A Dark Song that I saw recently. It was a fantastic, well, it was a character piece, first of all, but it was also just a really classily done ghost story, like a really great sort of ghost story, haunted house movie. Incredible soundtrack, but very minimalist, using what sounded like a lot of antique stringed instruments. And really only, you know, as is the case with a lot of independent features now, really only one location, but was so well executed that you didn't really see those scenes. You didn't really see like, oh, okay, well, you know, maybe they made a movie about 2 actors in one location because that's all that they could, you know, on their budget level afford to make a film about. But it didn't really, as well, you know, that might have been the case, but the film didn't feel like it, like that was a detriment to it. It didn't feel like it needed to be something other than it was. It just executed what it was beautifully. And I hope that, you know, it's funny though, because I also didn't hear a lot about that movie. Maybe I just haven't done my research, but that was one that I'm kind of surprised I didn't hear about doing more on the festival circuit. And even that film that I mentioned earlier that inspired me, that movie by Seth Smith called Low Life, that was a movie that you know, it played a handful of festivals, but I haven't really seen it embraced by the horror community in the way that I think that it deserves, because it's an incredible movie. But luckily, Seth's new movie, The Crescent, has played at TIFF and has gone on to play at a whole lot of other film festivals. So his work is finally getting the attention that I think it deserves. So
Excellent.
But it is exciting to see a lot of these more atmosphere-based horror filmmakers start to get the film festival reception that they have earned. So hopefully we see more of that in the coming years.
Yeah. I mean, there is certainly festivals that have a more broad view of horror films. In Edinburgh, where I'm recording, there's a horror film festival called Dead by Dawn, and it has your very much your traditional slasher films and stuff like that, but it also has more experimental horror films, and it has a lot of different types of horror movies in its
Mm-hmm.
purview, kind of. Yeah.
I've heard a lot of great things about that festival. That's one that I also don't hear people talk about quite as much as some of these others. I'm not entirely sure what accounts for that because I'm pretty sure Dead by Dawn's been around for quite a while at this point. But yeah, I don't know. It sounds like you
Yeah.
have a pretty.
Next year, I believe it's its 25th anniversary.
Oh wow! Holy cow! That's impressive for any festival to stick around for that long because they're kind of inherently unsustainable. They're in the same way that a lot of DIY venues are unsustainable. You know, these endeavors are often, you know, spearheaded by a handful of really dedicated individuals. So that's great. I hope to make it there someday, either with this project or something else in the future. I haven't been to that side of the pond since I was very young, so maybe one of these days I'll have an excuse to make the trip.
Excellent. Hopefully you will.
There you go.
Well, I think that's all. It's great to have you on the show. It's great talking to you. And I will hope to have you back when you've got your next project, whatever that may be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on here. This was a lot of fun. Best of luck with your future episodes, and thanks again for having me on your inaugural episode of your podcast. Best of luck to you.
Thank you very much, Torin.
Thank you. Take care.
So that was my guest, Torin Langen. I hope you enjoyed our chat as much as I did. If you did, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from. Also, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. If you didn't like it, just move on. Listen to another podcast. There's loads out there. But that's all from me now. Join us next month for another brand new action-packed episode of New Horror Express.